What's the hustle like for startups across the Pacific? Hi, everyone. My name is Jason, originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today's guest is Pat Yiu, a gamer and entrepreneur with several startups in the US, Singapore, and China. Currently, he is head of strategy, Nouns Esports, and Nouns Agency, while also nursing other projects to life. He has extensive experience working in China and other countries around the world. He has served as COO of Valts, co-founder and CEO of Hexing Esports Technologies Limited, marketing director, a professional gamer at Cloud9 Esports, Inc., and more. Welcome back to the Bridge to China, Pat.
Thanks, Jason, for such a wonderful introduction. It's nice to be back on the bridge today.
We've been friends for many years, but I have to say the thing I'm most curious about is you are in some way or were in some way interested in horse breeding. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I watched a video of this horse named Flightline a couple of years ago. And for anyone who doesn't know what Flightline is a thoroughbred horse that was able to win all of the major races in a single year. And after competing for a couple of years, he has now retired into studying, which is helping breed other horses. And you can make up to $200,000 US dollars a day by studying. And I found that pretty interesting and wanted to learn more. That culminated into Joel, a lawyer from Chicago, and a few other people kind of building through what we consider to be the first thoroughbred horse racing club that allows someone to own a fraction of a horse for as little as $1,500. That reduces the barrier of entry that kind of historically has cost six figures or more to maintain a horse with like one of these like jockey clubs, and allows more hobbyists to actually come in and enjoy the ownership of a century-old sport. Our newest horse has done okay this year. It's our first horse, and he won a second place at Saratoga Downs. But I think we're just starting the journey now, and we won't really know how much the potential this horse has for another few years.
So you sell or the company sold shares of horses.
Yeah,
the breeding capacity.
Yeah, so you're buying into a fractionalized share, almost like an ETF of a horse, like stock, right? So I think it's better to not put all of your money onto a single horse, but maybe like play the entire field. And so anything from, you can buy into additional shares of like race winnings or additional shares of studying if it gets there. And it also provides you more access, like getting down to the green or like the winner's circles. A lot of like what kind of makes the sport beautiful, but just lowering that financial cost of being able to access it.
That is wild. I never thought that horse racing was. I just imagined, millionaires, super millionaires with their yachts and owning horses. But yeah, I guess that is remarkable that just anyone can get involved in that now for a fraction, literally, of the cost. So you've worked extensively in cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. For those of us who don't know, it's a big mystery. So could you tell us, what does the current crypto market look like? And what are those really tiny cryptocurrencies that people should be watching out for, in your opinion?
Yeah, I joined the blockchain industry around the beginning of 2021, but I've been interested in cryptocurrencies since about 2010. So kind of like where it first, like a couple of years after it first started. I primarily focus on open source development and nonprofit work while kind of investing in the infrastructure side. So I'm not too in tune with what tokens are popular for day-to-day trading. But I think that based on the US elections, we've definitely seen a market jump already. So a lot of the upside of these tokens has already been priced in. I do believe that the macro is going to be quite volatile while the US figures out their regulatory procedures for the next 4 years, and would probably tell retail investors maybe look for a dip period between some of the major tokens like a Bitcoin or Ethereum. And like, yeah, just the word of advice is that when you're like working around with blockchain assets, it's very much like playing options trading with that volatility. And so put in money that you're okay losing, and definitely just don't buy when the markets are super, super high already.
So, I mean, do you think it's a good strategy for people who are just jumping in to buy something, maybe, I don't know, whatever amount, $1,000, whatever it is, like something that's worth currently like 0.00005, percent of a dollar, like, and you just buy millions of them? Is that a strategy that people are using in the hopes that these things are going to rise up?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, excuse my language, but I think that we have these things called meme coins, or in other words, shit coins, and these are tokens that we would consider the same thing as a penny stock, right? And I would say, like, you're buying a penny stock, so you never know if that company is going to be successful or not. You never know if it's going to be picked up and listed by other exchanges. So while yes, like you could have bought in a Solana, or even you could have bought in a Bitcoin at $1 at one point. Most tokens aren't like Bitcoin, so just I would say have an air of caution and be okay to lose that money if you're going into a lower cap token.
What about, since Elon Musk is related to the incoming administration in some way, he's sort of tied himself to the incoming Trump administration in the White House. Like, what is it, Dogecoin, and what's the other one, Puppies or something? Those are related to him in some way. Do you think because he's related to the incoming administration that laws will be passed that will facilitate his coins being worth more in the future? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I actually got to talk with Doge designer recently and kind of follow the Trump administration's election process, and so I don't think that Elon actually cares that much about tokens per se. He thinks that Doge is like he's a Shiba Inu, right? That has
Doge.
is a popular one from Tokyo, and so I think people have rallied around that meme almost like it's a cult. The same way that we kind of like look at Scientologists in America, right? Like there is a Church of Doge and people believe in that. Um, do I think that Elon will adopt Doge more than maybe just as a possible currency to transact on buying a Tesla or anything else like that? Most likely not. I've heard I think that more likely what will happen is that the U.S. will look at kind of like what it looks like to build their own blockchain. Could they create like a stable like U.S. dollar backed reserve on top of that? That's probably where they're more at. They did. If you had seen the meme for Department of Government Efficiency, that actually got created into a token just by the community, and I think probably crossed 400 to 600 million dollar market cap on the first couple days. So yeah, I would say wait until regulatory like processes are posted. Like I don't really trust anything in the news until I see it in fine print.
Wow. What about China? What is China doing in blockchain right now?
Yeah, so it's been interesting because in 2018, because China blocked all of the ownership of blockchain assets, it actually caused a significant like market pullback. Uh, in just last week, China had just said that it is no longer illegal for an individual citizen to own blockchain assets, which was a huge like kind of like new thing into the market. We just spent a couple of weeks over back in Beijing this past month, and what I would say is that China's focused on IP. They're focused on RWAs or real world assets along with CBDCs. And so they're taking a lot slower of an approach. You have a 1.4 billion population that you're dealing with, right? And so consumer protections become extremely important, especially with the less educated class. Imagine that same token you're talking about, but there's now 100,000 of those tokens in the market, and every little city is being pushed a different token. Like that is the catastrophic issue that could happen if they release blockchain way too early. And so I would say China's approach will be slow and methodical. They probably care deeply about the macro environment and probably owning some type of the financial service side, similar to kind of like how they've treated Alipay or like WeChat Pay as a baby. I think that they want to own some of that interchange relay available in whatever network they choose to go on to.
Does the Chinese digital RMB still exist? Is that something that's still around?
Yeah, I would say it's not really a blockchain asset. I think that there's a lot, the only government approved payment systems are this thing called like eRMB, but I would say it's the same way that you would think of like RMB on WeChat Pay or RMB on Alipay. It's a digital equivalent that is tied to like whatever your bank account or whatever you've topped up, right? So whenever I like send this company 3 RMB, I get 3 RMB of this digital version of it. I don't know if they'll ever really make this fully open to the rest of the world to transact on, kind of like a Forex token. But I mean, their systems have been built to essentially transact in their own currency.
Hmm. So I noticed you were in Beijing very recently announcing a partnership with the Copyright Bureau. Could you tell us about that project?
Yeah, so our company Nouns DAO, I mean, not even a company, it's what we consider a DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. We're one of the largest in the world at the moment and also have made a transition into 501c3 status, which is a nonprofit organization. We started talking to China specifically about kind of expanding blockchain efforts in this country. We focus on character IPs, building animation festivals, funding open source development of resources, but also in China, like we have remodeled mountains and we are building animal shelters across multiple cities and already partnering with the local governments, as most recently with Urumqi in Xinjiang. And so it's really like a for good project, and I think that's what attracted them to kind of like using us as a consultancy for how they want to implement their own blockchain.
So, I mean, what is the blockchain actually going to be used for? Copyright. So this is about trademark or patent law or something?
Yeah, so I'm gonna step away from my microphone for a second and show you actually. So think of RWAs as real world assets, right? And so we in the West, we're able to build a token out of anything. If I want to make Shiba Inu token or if I want to make Jason token, I can do that and it's completely okay in the world. Kind of treats it a little bit differently. And so I'll use porcelain as an example. And hopefully this shows up on the camera decently well. But imagine tying like a master porcelain like crafter and what they want to sell to a digital asset, right? When you scan this code for as a one-time use, you essentially can prove that this was created by like a master crafter versus it being like just a factory made porcelain out of Taobao or something. So that you can really think of their blockchain being used for authentication, like COAs, certificates of authentication, more than the speculative nature that the rest of the world has kind of looked into.
So this ensures the quality of the product that you're consuming.
Exactly.
And
so
this
you
works,
can think of this, yeah.
It's transnational.
Thus far, these systems are built for like within the country. They are currently expanding with like passport access, etc. But they're so early on that I believe they want to test the system out a lot more before trying to go global with it.
Wow. Okay, so let's go back to your past in China a little bit because you have spent extensive time in China. I met you here when you were living in Beijing at that time. What were you doing at that time?
Yeah, when I came in 2017, I think we met actually about a month into my time in China. And so 25-year-old me didn't speak any Chinese when I came. And so I think I was really happy to meet some foreigner friends in the country that we lived in. But my last time around was for esports, for like professional video games. And we were focused on creating an IP acquisitions company of some of the largest digital festivals around the world, and also creating domestic events like the World University Cyber Games, which to date is still the largest collegiate event that's ever happened for video games. A lot of it was just kind of expanding international esports and showcasing how China's market has enough population to actually support ticket sales, where that hasn't actually happened in the rest of the world yet.
I'm really surprised. I thought these you're talking about gaming expositions where professional gamers compete with the crowd. Yes?
Yeah, so like China is a region just with population scale, right? They are the largest consumers of video games by total population, and so it kind of in the same way we can sell out like a Staples Center or like a Madison Square Garden in the U.S. for a tournament, like for a championship game, obviously. But China has consistently been able to have the population scale to do weekly shows in every single one of their major cities and be able to consistently sell that out. The U.S. just being as fragmented as it is, we can't sell out a 50,000 person stadium every single week, and so China is definitely a little bit further ahead on that in that they have adopted into this kind of esports gaming culture a lot faster than the rest of the world.
Wow. Games are very, very popular in China. Sometimes the government throws regulations, especially at very young people, especially teens should be in studying for high school, so that they can limit the amount of video gaming that they actually do. What do you think about that?
I actually completely agree. Like, I think it's important for kids to be using their time effectively. Like, I'm a total degenerate when it comes to playing video games. If you let me like run loose, I'll probably play like 40 hours a week if I really had the option to. But growing up, like I went to math school and I went to like an English prep class. I also played tennis and I had basketball and all these other extracurriculars. I think that right now with kids, there's such an emphasis on getting to university, but I do think it is important for a child to be well-rounded, not only for sports, but also just things that help you with critical thinking. I think gaming is a part of that, where like in the right situations, we're seeing a lot more collegiate and intramural esports activities. And the reason for that is like, imagine like I'm like a kind of like a scrawny, more introverted child, right? I may not be interested in going to the football team or joining the football team, but I still want to learn some of those collaborative, like just collaborative lessons that you can get from playing in a team sport. Like gaming actually now becomes an alternative for that, where you can still learn a lot of those same leadership values, but it has to be structured. If you're just playing games to play games, then it's not really effective in the same way where Minecraft can be an amazing learning skill. And I've heard enough parents tell me that their child became interested in programming because of playing Minecraft, that there are positive values. It's really just when you excessively play games without that mindset that it becomes a detriment to the child.
Mm-mm. I have some strange questions just out of the blue here. Are there games that are focused on academics themselves? So can you learn mathematics from a game or science from a game?
Yeah, there actually are a lot, and even in China, there's a live streaming application that had this like brain check where it was just like speed run math questions, right? And it was meant for children. It was meant for like middle schoolers and high schoolers in China, and the game got taken over by adults. It was all people like in their post 30s who are now trying to compete with high school children over the leaderboard of who's best at simple mathematics. So I would say there's a lot of games that like even a video game like World of Warcraft, one of the most popular in the world. I would say that my interest in how market economies work, especially at the macro scale, come from me playing the auction house in World of Warcraft when I was in high school. It's just that most people don't really look for like the real world synergies, and most people are just playing to relax, right? And so once again, it's like there are games specifically built for education. You probably played Oregon Trail when you were growing up, right? And to this day, I know if you don't have the right nutrients, you get dysentery, and so you know, there's always a little bit of education lesson.
I'm kind of surprised someone of your, in your generation knows about Oregon Trail to begin with, because I played that when I was like in 5th grade or something on a computer that, made beep and bop sounds. Okay, I wanted to ask you, as an entrepreneur who kind of gets all over the field, in my opinion, what is it like for Americans who are trying to get a foothold in China? What is it like trying to get into the commercial space in China as an American? What opportunities kind of are there, and what should people be on guard for?
Yeah, I would say I'll try to split this question into a few different answers. So I think that first, China's always looking for subject matter experts. So that's generally the market that you're able to take advantage of in China. Like when we first got over, we were considered esports experts because we had been running international events already successfully across Europe and North America, whereas China was only doing events domestically. I think that for someone who's interested in trying to get a foothold in China, you could probably start off with consulting, maybe project-based work as you build up your own client network. Helps to speak the Chinese language. You get a lot more opportunities as you build your own community of peers. But if you're kind of always trusting somebody else to do business for you, you're always going to be losing that cut. And once you figure out something that makes sense, it's always good in China to test the waters. It's a different country than anywhere else in that in China, you can think of it as if I make 1 RMB off each person in China, I'm now a billionaire. Versus in everywhere else, it's like I need to be making $100 off of each of these customers. I can only hit 2% of the audience base. It's a whole different type of market, and so I think it's important for anybody coming to China to understand that you are playing for scalability versus like dollar per user in this country.
What about challenges that exist in working in China as an investor or someone who's looking for VC, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll explain challenges from a non-financial level, and then I'll go back into the VC side. So I would say definitely language barrier and cultural differences are probably the biggest thing. I personally came to China with very, very basic Mandarin, and it took me a long time to kind of understand the hidden meanings behind certain phrases, along with like the nuances of like Chinese versus Western business culture. China has a lot of these bells and whistles, such as understanding kind of like when you're working with government, where should you seat somebody, or how should you kind of plan these conversations out through a night, or even the concept of like jingzhou, if you're familiar with that, Jason, which is like going around and kind of having a small glass of drink with somebody or other people at the table. Even how to follow up with those new acquaintances can all it becomes. I would say it was cumbersome at first, but it's also a part of doing business. And once you learn it, it's a pretty awesome culture that they build around it. Those are the main challenges when coming here, is just learning how to adapt to a different working culture. In terms of venture, China is very much kind of very similar to the UK in that they like to fund companies who have already shown market success. In America, we focus on kind of like a lot of it's speculation, right? We look at the right team, we look at does this market have potential, and we gauge our first bets on founders versus like gauging it on product. Whereas in China, it's very much they want to see that you already have some level of ARR, or that you have like some partnerships in place before they do any round of funding. So it's just they invest at a little bit of a later stage, and they like to have companies find more product market fit before they commit dollars in the country.
What do you think about VC in the United States for companies that are planning to grow into China, are U.S. VC companies still interested in breaching into China?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen companies try to enter the Chinese market. I would say most recently, I would say like Sequoia made a fairly large effort, which is Hongshan in China. I think part of it is that like when you make these venture bets, because of China's way of doing business, you're losing a lot of the upside. I myself as an investor, I look at the pre-seed level, so kind of when these companies are at like a $1 to $5 million valuation, whereas in China you can see these like kind of first deals happening around the $20 to $100 million mark. So you've already lost a 20x multiplier if you believe that a company is going to become $1 billion company. A good example of this is that if you look at the rate of return for, let's say, Sequoia China versus Sequoia India has been able to take riskier bets, but those bets have paid off a lot better. And there's essentially just a larger pie to be eaten if you in other markets. I do believe that in China, there's part of it is that they really focus on domestic only. And so a lot of the Western VCs have their biggest strengths in globalizing a company, but most of the companies that are venture investable in China don't really have a plan to go international. They have a large enough of a market to stay domestic. And so that kind of becomes the issue is that a lot of these investors don't understand fully like what they're getting themselves into, and that a lot of these companies just don't want to go global because of the pain that it takes to actually do that.
Well, I mean, that's actually brings me to an interesting question because, as someone who actually does business instead of someone thinks about it theoretically, you're in the United States, which for the 70s, 80s, 90s was considered the largest consumer market in the entire world. Now, maybe that's shifting because China has hundreds of millions of people, and what it defines as its middle class. Do you think that China is replacing the United States as the foremost consumer class in the world?
Yeah, I think for better or for worse, that is happening. I would say over the past 4 years in the US, I've definitely seen people try to be less consumerist. I think that's a Gen Z shift actually, in that like I would say older millennials, like we are the people who like luxury brands like Prada or YSL or Chanel and things like that. Whereas I do believe that Gen Z is a lot more in tune with kind of like they like Temu and they like these other like kind of shops, and they're spending a lot less money and they're more into fast fashion. Part of it is just that trends change so quickly, and they haven't gotten to that age yet where they really care about buying something for life. I myself like was a pretty large consumer when I lived in China, and kind of going back to the United States, I've been buying more quality brands, like products that will last 10 plus years. So I do agree. Like China does seem like it's one of the capitals for consumerism, and I would say like I would like to see more Chinese domestic brands. I really like what Anta and I really like what Li Ning have been able to do. I'm actually wearing a pair of like these Li Ning slides right now that were fully sold out across all of China. And I would like to see more of an emphasis on domestic brands versus continuing to let foreign brands in. A case in point is like look at where Lululemon is today in China, and they have the largest Lululemons in the world, all in Shanghai and other places like that. And it would have been cool to see a Chinese brand like kind of take over that like athletic wear area, but unfortunately, nobody's really been able to compete yet.
So you come to China periodically. But you've also done business in some capacity in Europe and all over the world, actually. What keeps bringing you back to China specifically? Is it just business?
My honest answer is probably that I miss the food a lot. Chinese food is really is bad and expensive, and I just had Szechuan food the other night and spent $200 on a takeout meal. But it's kind of like how I see Starbucks in
Wow.
China as someone from Seattle. We have this term like "yo gui yo nan ci," and I kind of agree. It's like Chinese food is not like it's just not as good anywhere else in the world, and it's always way more expensive. Jokes
Hmm.
aside, I think I've always been interested in Chinese culture as a second generation Chinese American. And during COVID, I spent the majority of my time kind of mentoring Chinese nationals who are looking to become entrepreneurs in the United States. I've been lucky enough that three of my mentees are all unicorn founders now, so founders of a $1 billion plus valuation companies. And as COVID cleared up, I kind of went back to doing the same thing, started traveling again, and just exploring what the opportunities are in China. Every year that China goes by, there's 10 new things that you can do in it. It's really just making the time and meeting the right people of who has funding available.
There's so many new products coming out in China, and I noticed that Amazon finally has home delivery services opening up. I guess that was a legal issue, but I mean, with flying vehicles, aerial vehicles. But in China, we already had that to some extent because there are booths around. It's just a lot of the things that are happening in the United States. They're mirrored by things that are happening in China. It's just really interesting. For example, in Wuhan, a city where you used to live, they're the largest taxi fleet of unmanned cars. It's remarkable. Have you been back to Wuhan since they started that?
I haven't. I was just talking about how I wanted to guozao in Wuhan, so I might have to go back in January or February. I'd like to, but I haven't had the time yet myself.
And they also have a flying car service there. It does not go anywhere you want, but it goes from specific locations to other locations. Unmanned flying car, you get in. I think it's like 90 RMB, which is like what, $12. You get to fly across the city. It's absolutely amazing with some of the stuff that's going. I think it's just regulatory stuff because the technology exists kind of around the world, in my opinion.
I'm sure it's just like FAA laws is that there probably is a lot more commercial activity in the United States, and we have higher like zoning laws for this. Like even I think in Seattle, it's like you can't fly your drone above a certain height, otherwise you like violate something in Seattle. It's really just it's just protection of consumers, right? I do want to try this like flying car. I was seeing one also. I think I don't know if it's from Xiaomi or somebody else, but there's this $250,000 like car that turns into a helicopter, and it's fully sold out pre-orders. So it does seem like China's going much faster than the rest of the world for this. But if you look at how their train infrastructure works, it makes sense. China is very, very good at making things very efficient. And I like the trains this time, like it used to, Shanghai to Nanjing used to be a 2-hour train before COVID. It's now an hour and 20 minutes. It is so quick to get around China if you just go on the right train tracks or on the right high-speed rails.
So you're mentoring people. Let's bring out, I kind of already asked this question, but I want to ask it again. What kind of advice would you give to especially young entrepreneurs who without a lot of experience who are interested in doing business in China's mainland?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is build your network, but also build your own core skills. So my first time in China back in 2017 throughout 2020, I had to rely on my business partners' networks, and that caused a lot of kind of internal conflicts when trying to do business because you're not using your own relationships, you're using other people's relationships. When I came back in 2023, I spent the time to kind of build my own contacts, the right private business owners, the right networks of people who are already doing business in China, the right government entities to work with, who are already successful in the country in their own right, and that's led to a lot more opportunities based on trust and repeat business. I think that's the thing about China is that it's really built on trust, right? So it's either an introduction through a mutual friend or it's you building that trust over time. But I think that's why I say build your network first.
Yeah, the concept of guanxi is kind of serious. This is interesting because my father was a business person in the United States. He owned a construction company. And when I think of ideas like guanxi or mianza, I think of my father's business as a point of reference. And it always makes me wonder, in China, is stuff that dissimilar? Because it doesn't seem like it was. Like for my father, for example, with guanxi, he had a very good network in the United States of friends that he did business with on every aspect of his business. And so in China, you have guanxi. So to me, I always thought, is there really much of a difference? So when you're thinking about networking in the United States and networking in China, what are the similarities and differences in your view?
I'm trying to think about this.
You can do that Elon Musk thing where you just look away into silence for a minute.
Yeah, I would say in the US, we're a lot more data driven, right? In that I think that the US is very calculated in their approach of how they do business. Whereas in China, like sometimes we look at potential and we look at like lower hanging fruit. That goes into more of a philosophical question of like, do we like to be become a more efficient economy, or do we like to innovate an economy, right? And I think that something I learned in the West is that we're able to take a lot more risks, and that's why we kind of have like very innovative companies, and you see a lot more by like venture invested business. We see a higher percentage coming out of the US of becoming these billion-dollar companies, is that we do have that kind of drive of innovation. But I would say China's like you look at China in military technology, like surveillance, you look at them in IoT, like China has won pretty much all of the markets outside of AI for anything that's like high tech. And then it's the US that really gets to take some of this technology because China focuses on manufacturing, right? They make like really, really good like base products. And then the United States can take that same technology, package it, and kind of innovate on top of it, of blending that together. Both countries have their own merits. It's just they focus on different areas of the pipeline. But I do see China becoming more and more innovative. They're bringing a lot of foreign talent back. I would say AI during COVID was like a really big letdown for me to kind of see so many AI researchers leave for Canada around the world. But I do believe, like, especially in surveillance, like future military technology, like everything that I'm seeing outside of China is like looking absolutely like amazing. And even just look at 5G itself. China is the only place in the world where I genuinely feel like I have 5G everywhere in the country, whereas you go to other countries and it still kind of feels like a 3.5 to 4G experience, even though like the button on your phone says 5G.
I actually had someone complain about a previous show where they were like, "Oh, Jason, you've deceived me because I didn't have 5G for this like 10-minute period on a train." So it's not, I just want to say that it's not perfect everywhere, but it is a lot better here. I wanted to ask you about the gaming sphere in China for people who are interested in moving into gaming in China. What cities or localities are especially gamified?
Yeah, I think recently, like if you look at like TikTok or anything else, everyone's going to tell you Chongqing is like this cyberpunk city. But I think that like Chengdu, Wuhan, Hangzhou, Zhuhai specifically for games development, these tier two cities that kind of focus on like kind of younger audiences, like Wuhan being the city that has the largest amount of college students in the world. I think these tier two cities are getting more and more influence for gaming. You kind of have two choices from a business perspective. You can either choose to join Tencent or NetEase, the mainstream network, or you can try to go with a smaller developer or try to make an indie game yourself. The latter generally gets acquired instead of trying to compete with a duopoly that is Tencent and NetEase inside of the company. And so even like Kuro Games, which has been like a sprawling star this past couple of years, making their game Wuthering Waves, they were just fully acquired after their first success also. And so, yeah, I would say go to a tier two city. Like it's cheaper and more fun. You have just as many people who are interested in games, and it's a lot cheaper cost of living.
I gotta say, I love Wuhan personally. It's an amazing city. So I have actually been watching some of Tate and Rogan, and some of their people that are like them. What are your personal philosophy when it comes to startups and companies, and with whom you do business?
Yeah, Tate's definitely one of those like influencers who has both sides to it, right? People either love him or hate him, but I think in the end he's just a more controversial creator. Um, I think that young people see so much advice online, but they don't really have real world experience to judge alongside that advice most of the time. One of the reasons that I think we see this culture of like tangping in China now, which is for anybody who doesn't speak Chinese, it's like kind of like laying flat, and it's really this like kind of Gen Z and onwards thing because they don't have that intrinsic motivation to be more than what they currently are. I think that's something that you have to find passion in and then spend that time to become an expert in your field or have a reason to become an expert. And the reality is that like part of building businesses is luck. Like I would say like even for some of my businesses, like it just that one lucky social media moment or something else has like played a large part in my businesses. But a lot of it is it's your ability to work harder than anyone else, right? Which requires you to actually need that motivation. I try not to take these influencers like videos to heart because they're always cut out and it's clipped, right? It's meant for social media engagement. But if I think that it's good for you to kind of have these role models, and I would say maybe it'd be better for you to read some books from people instead of maybe watching clips. It'd be better for you to kind of like understand the entire thought process of like how that motivation can work versus like you kind of getting a short dopamine hit. That's my only worry with these TikTok videos is that you get the dopamine hit, but then you don't get a solution after that, right? So you're continuously looking for that dopamine hit without really finding like what's next after.
Well, what one or two books have you read that you think are highly motivational for people who are entering into business as a young person?
Yeah, I think that any book that kind of talks about how you can like turn your learning more efficient. I'm trying to think. There's this one book that's is it Atomic Habits? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I believe it is called Atomic Habits, but that was a book I read really early on in my career, and I still recommend it to this day. And it's really the concept of if I get 1% better at something every single day, right? Then eventually over the course of a year or 2 years, that 1% compounds over time. It's the same way where we try to teach financial literacy and say $200 here, $200 there, you're essentially maxing out your 401k or your other retirement options, right? By the time that you're actually retired, the market like has compounded over and over, and you have a retirement fund. I think it's a good one. Another one is like there's a book that I really like is How to Win Friends and Influence People, and alternatively there's a Swedish book called Surrounded by Idiots. It's really the concept of kind of understanding the world you live in, right? Like you always want someone else to understand you, but you don't understand. Like a lot of people don't understand that every single human is unique, right? And it's understanding how to understand each other that makes you influential. And I think that that's like it's a soft skill that you need to have, which is essentially negotiation and being able to do banter. Like these are very important soft skills to have when doing business. So I think it's just as important as your own technical abilities.
I think it was the CEO of NVIDIA posted something on social media recently where he talks about the 1% thing, where if you just become better at something 1% over time, that it adds up. So I saw that as well, because basically he was like, okay, this say if your investment every day is 1 versus someone who is 1.1, then he shows how that if you just multiply 1 times 1.01 365 times, you end up with this much larger number. And so yeah, just putting in a little tiny bit more effort than your competitors is going to matter over time. But people like you, I think specifically, because I mention you a lot, and a lot more than you, I think to people as like my example of a young person who is highly motivated because of the amount of stuff that you're engaged with versus the other young people your age that I know. So I'm kind of curious. It doesn't feel to me like you just got your knowledge or your desire to be successful from books. So what drives you to move to the next thing and to the next thing and the next thing? And what do you think in your childhood or an lesson your dad or your mom taught you, or is it just the way you're built? I mean, what keeps you going and keeps you coming back for more and more?
Yeah, I've thought about this question a lot, and I would say part of it is like I do have ADHD, and I think that I got the lucky kind, right? So it's like I got the kind that's like instead of being hard to focus, I like to focus on a lot of different things. So in essence, I think it's a blessing and a curse in that I normally don't stay in industries longer than 5 years, and I kind of always like to see what's in the cutting edge. But I would attribute that partly to growing up in Seattle. I got to see the rise of Boeing, the start of Amazon. I got to see Microsoft and Nintendo kind of grow to power here. And I grew up in an area like my hometown, Seattle. It was once known for the highest percentage of books read per capita and the highest percentage of books sold per capita and the highest percentage of PhDs per capita, right? And so when you think of that combination of kind of like the learner's mentality coupled with really, really like a lot of days of rain, you get to spend so much more time reading as a child, right? Um, I'm lucky in that the industry I chose was technologies, and so like I was at the start of esports, and then I went into kind of blockchain at the cusp of it becoming like globally adopted, and then I've been now investing in AI, and now going back to blockchain again as an infrastructure provider. And so for me, it's really just it's exciting. I like to see how technology changes. I grew up in the transition between DSL and from dial-up into DSL, and so I only had dial-up internet in my home for about half a year before we made that transition to DSL. So when the microwave turns on and your internet disconnects, I didn't get to experience that like pioneering of the internet. um, I know that for you, I'm sure that maybe it's like, oh yeah, I'm glad that we don't have that anymore, but I never got to experience the first 1.0 iteration of the internet. And so for me, I think part of it is like I want to be part of that cutting edge of the next generation of internet.
Can we talk about Boeing for a second? Because, they seem to be a company that is, trying to reinvent themselves. I think it was the Starliner was making a beeping sound. So two astronauts who were supposed to spend 8 days at the International Space Station are going to instead spend 8 months. They're supposed to come back in February, if I'm not mistaken. They also have had quite a few difficulties with some of their planes. Even mainstream American media is commenting on that, and they usually don't dog their own companies. So what do you think about the way that they're restructuring and focusing on less and doing more with it? What do you think about the new CEO? Where do you think Boeing is going?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Boeing's CEO or their core business to talk on that, but I would say like they coming from I was in Beijing, I was talking with their head of Asia sales, and so I've kind of heard the internal conflicts along with like what you see in the press. I think Boeing has an issue in that third party too many things, and they don't own enough of their supply chain, right? In an effort to save overall costs in the long run, they decided to kind of outsource areas that they most likely shouldn't have. There was a 787 that I think it was a 787 that the door actually fell off of because it wasn't hinged correctly. And I would say like when issues like that happen, and it's you find out it's a third party, maybe it's time for you to maybe reacquire some of those process lines and supply chains and maybe bring them in house for a higher quality standard. I don't know like what to do to fix this though, because the reality is that whenever you're a public company, you have to make money for your investors, right? And so like from the upper level management side, they're weighing risk of like, like can we cut a little bit of costs on this area to generate higher percentage returns for our accounting. And so like that's the kind of unfortunate side when you get to these large businesses, is that even this like small 1% change to your profit line could actually be catastrophic if you have like a bad PR event. This year, they've just been really unlucky with in multiple areas of their business. They've kind of had sour news, and they even had the employee strike this past month, which I think lost them billions of dollars also. And so, yeah, they'll get better. I mean, it's Boeing. It's like there's only like they're a top 3 company in their industry, right? And so I'm sure that they'll get through this, and it's really just kind of tightening up how their supply chains work.
Can I ask you about EVs? Obviously, Tesla is a huge player in the global community for electronic vehicles. It's not going anywhere, especially with Elon's just personality. He's a global force. I don't think I can meet a Chinese person who doesn't know who Elon Musk is. And so, he's a global personality, probably more famous than our presidents. What do you think about Chinese EVs, and what do you think about Tesla? Is there enough market space for everyone?
Yeah, you're putting me into a tight predicament here. I am team Chinese EV. So I started saying this I think back in April when I got to Dubai the day of the Great Floods, and so it was actually a BYD, a nice like brand new BYD that saved me during my trip there, and he helped me wade the waters across 12-inch like kind of like muddy water, and like the largest like rain flood that they've ever had like in the last 100 years. So I think that Chinese EVs have caught up already. I think Tesla has a better brand name, right? But my biggest worry is actually like it's not so much about the EV companies, but it's like, I'd really like to know like what happens to these batteries after 10 years. Like I hear that Tesla is going to have issues with some of these batteries as they kind of go into like just into the end of their life cycle. I haven't looked enough into it, but like I did notice like that Nouns brand of electric cars. I'm very happy when I'm in Thailand or Dubai or anywhere else and a BYD picks me up because I know it's going to be a newer model of car. I would say like 2018, I wasn't convinced. I felt like there were still a lot of issues with their sedans, but I would say I'm very happy when I get picked up in a BYD car that's fully electric nowadays, or any of the other like kind of Roways or anything else like that. I think that if China can go global with these, like we could see like a Toyota Honda effect in that I think a lot of people using EVs could adopt these Chinese models. They're a lot cheaper than the Tesla, right? And I'm not convinced that the Tesla is like, for the price point versus the Chinese EV, I'm not convinced that Tesla actually provides that much more value.
Actually, I have to say the BYDs that I've sat in, and I take a lot of DDs, which is the China's answer to Uber here in China, are very spacious. I usually sit in the back too, and there's just an enormous amount of space to like sit there. Like, getting into them is easy. So for me, that is a big deal. But they are incredibly affordable. Not in the United States though. Even though there's 100% tariff, I think it's actually still more affordable than American brands. But Chinese brands are actually not that interested in exporting to the United States, even though I think they could, even with 100% tariff. So I think that's kind of confusing. Although Chinese EVs are moving to Europe, it's fascinating to watch. But I was also interested in the battery technology because I heard a lot of people talking about that, and I did an entire episode of this show about that. And what we learned was that 95% of EV batteries are already globally being recycled because the chemical contents of those batteries are actually extremely expensive, and it's actually cheaper to just take it back out of the battery than to mine it somewhere in a developing country. So hopefully they can get that last 5% eventually. I'm sure that chemists are working on it all over the world. I wanted to ask you about maybe something you didn't experience. I don't imagine you ever had a job as a barista in Seattle. So what about folks, in your opinion, philosophically, who do have a 9 to 5, and maybe they've been out of college for a few years, and they're thinking, oh, I want to create my own business, but they have difficulty taking that first step where they have to invest somehow and take a risk. What do you think about the philosophy of risk taking to get to becoming a business person as opposed to just an employee?
Yeah, I'm actually helping a couple founders who are just like that, like a bakery shop owner who started off on Instagram, who's now like looking at her first brick and mortar after crossing 6 figures in sales, like that type of entrepreneur. I recommend nights and weekends. I work with enough people who are both parents, but also like, they work like an enterprise level job during daytime. And I think launching your own business is something that creates risk and uncertainty in your life. And it also takes away from your personal life at times. Like imagine you being a parent and you're not only working a 40-hour work week, but also you're now trying to do nights and weekends to start a side business. It's really tough depending on when you start becoming an entrepreneur. So I started off at 25, single, and also willing to travel the world. I was coming off of a couple years of savings, and so I had very low risk. I hadn't owned a home during the time when I tried to become an entrepreneur. Now as a homeowner, I have to be a little bit less risky. But I think it's important to take the time to plan out your business, maybe get a little bit of traction and see. It's like, like when I start crossing that, like I'm making at least like, 3,000-4,000 US dollars a month in profit from this, and like kind of build that traction. And when you have enough saved to try it out full time, I would give yourself like a half year to a year of full runway to like be able to like take that time off from your regular work. Eventually you'll have to make a decision of like, kind of like, do you take that leap of faith if you believe that you can make a success, or do you not, and continue it as like a hobby business? That's up to you to decide as an entrepreneur. Like I would say if your upside is there and you really believe in the business, then I say take the shot at the younger you are. But as you get older, it gets a lot more hard because you just have so many more fixed expenses in your life.
I wanted to ask you about technology. We actually in person last year briefly. Between your meetings, you had a bunch of meetings lined up, and you were talking about the differences between North American technology hubs and Chinese technology hubs. Where do you think there are new opportunities for emerging technology, and what do you think are the similarities and differences between China and the United States, and maybe Canada too?
Yeah, I think that. So last year we talked on AI, and I would say in this period of time, I think that what I was talking to you about last year, in which I felt like North America was kind of getting ahead in AI hardware and agentic work, it has come true. The US is now the market leader for that, and kind of that it's always sniping of talent, right? Whenever you're in a new industry, it's like what government stipends can you give for people to move to other countries, which is immigration benefits. And I had said that Vancouver and Canada was doing the best job of providing these great passports for the smartest AI researchers, and lo and behold, they are probably one of the best hubs for AI research now. And I think that's like kind of what I think about when I think of China versus the US, right? Is that China has always been this kind of like semi-closed wall where you need to speak Chinese and you need to do all these other things to get access to it. Very good for someone like me who's Chinese American, where I can learn the language, I look Chinese, I can get through a lot of these like barriers. But what the U.S. does really well is that they don't look at your like language ability. They look at kind of like what do you bring to the table as a team. My hope with China over the next few years is I'd like to see more of an emphasis of kind of like it's almost like, and it's sad to say it, but it's like almost like Shark Tank. It's like I wish that they would create more, like in America we've commoditized like the entrepreneurship as like a entertainment value, right? The fact that we have Mark Cuban and all these other people on television like investing in small businesses where they're not even giving good deals to most of these projects, they're just giving them the publicity. But like most people in America have that idea, like I want to be a business owner, right? Or like they have the dream of that. I think if China could work more on that through both their like kind of like with realistic stories, like I want to know more about like the creator of Jingdong, or like the struggles that like maybe like a small local bank had that like when they were going national. Like I think there's so many like cool stories that can come out of China that can help motivate these people. Or even like imagine making a TV show that's just like talking about the creation of Douyin as a company, right? But then you dramatize it and you kind of place it towards that preteen to teenage audience. I think that the content always matches the next generation, and that's what I would like to see more of, is more opportunities for people to kind of be able to share ideas internationally while also staying like kind of intrinsically Chinese, but also content to support the next generation and make them actually want to be entrepreneurs.
You kind of already answered my next question, which is going to be what advice do you have for China to make its business environment more inviting? But most of the answers that you gave are really kind of China specific for Chinese young people. What about in terms of luring more investors and more entrepreneurs from the West to China? What advice would you give China? Because I mean, this is something you can do.
I would say a big hurdle that I deal with is that if you don't speak Chinese, it's very hard to do business in China, right? And I would say like nowadays the like AI transcoders are getting a lot better. I remember when I first spoke in China the first couple of years, their voice recording, their live translators couldn't keep up with my English pace, and so like the translators wouldn't even work for me. I think that's like a big part of it. Second part is that in China, a lot of the businesses, they don't have the same requirements as the United States in that we have to follow like a very strict regulatory procedure of like where our financial accounting is, right? And if you're someone who's Chinese, doing that due diligence is fairly simple. But as someone who's coming from the West, it's very, very hard to understand Chinese, like how like let's say a government stipend. You might like do business with the Beijing government, and you'll be billing for, let's say, 5 million RMB. But someone from China probably understands that that could be tranched, and that payment won't come up front with that money like immediately. You'll get it over the course of a couple tax periods, and that's how like government partnerships work. Whereas someone in the U.S. is like, why was this not stated in the original business terms? Like it's just a different way of doing business, and like I think that's education. It would be really cool if maybe there was like almost like a TV show, right, or something like that, where you have a bunch of foreign investors who all put like, let's say, $1 million into a Chinese fund, and then they get to do the same thing that like where I joined, which is the Overseas Technology Entrepreneurship Competition, but get to work with some of these Chinese businesses. They get to learn how Chinese businesses operate on a day-to-day basis, and then they get a chance to invest in some of these founders that they get to know better. I could see that being really, really interesting.
That does sound really interesting, but I think you would need, a joint partnership between media in the United States and China, or an English-speaking country and China, in order to produce an English program about doing business. That sounds fascinating. Actually, it's a really, really good idea. Let's talk about your trips to China. We don't have a lot of time left. You came to Beijing recently. Beyond all of your business dealings, what did you go see? What did you go do? What is fascinating for you about being in China? What did you want to see?
Yeah, honestly, I came here for work this trip, so I didn't really have any plans for sightseeing. I went to the Temple of Heaven. It is very commercialized. I didn't realize that they used to sacrifice humans at the top of that altar thousands of years ago, and then they swapped
That's
to.
news to me.
I learned the story. So they used to sacrifice humans for I think it was for rain or for famine or something, and then they essentially said that 100 normal people is the value of one royal person, and then after that like thing like imagine, right, you could sacrifice 100 villagers or one royal, and once the royals start getting sacrificed, they were like, oh yeah, we should start sacrificing animals instead. And essentially they went over to doing livestock after that. And I think of this as like one woman who got selected. She's like, my life is so important. Okay, no more human sacrifice. We're going to animals, and everything else is decided. It was really cool to kind of come back with a lot better Chinese language, being able to read some of this stuff together. But I also it was cool to see like blind boxes inside the Temple of Heaven. Like they've commercialized China in a way that like it makes you. Even myself as a Chinese American, I'm talking to you about porcelain, which I never thought I would be doing in my life, but I've become a fan of porcelain. Shanghai was really good for me this trip too. I went to my grandfather's grave. That's a little bit outside of Wuxi, and it was amazing to kind of see how well groomed the memorial was. Like it looked like a tiantang, like almost like a Hangzhou kind of like Siheyuan, and we had a trolley and everything to the space, and like it was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And I look back to like kind of thinking about how in America cemeteries are kind of depressing. They're like sad to go to, and like it like has the ambiance of sadness. Whereas in China, I feel like it was more of an ambiance of remembrance, and like it made me feel hopeful, and like it was just I had never it's something that I had never experienced before, but it was amazing. Food was amazing. I had Peking duck sashimi with caviar on top of it for the first time in Beijing. Absolutely bonkers. I always feel like Chinese food is so innovative, and I will have anything from like a durian crane to like Peking duck sashimi, and then I'll have kung pao chicken over like a grilled fish. That it's amazing to be back, and I'm excited to be coming more and more often over the next few years too.
You mentioned Urumqi. Did you get to go out there?
I didn't. So my wife, she's building animal shelters across China. So she partnered with the Urumqi local government along with the Neza EV company actually. And so she's been helping build out shelter programs. So kind of providing these like really well like these sustainable shelters for dogs and cats that are strays inside the winter, providing free cat food or dog food for those regions also, and then also creating TNVR programs, which are trap, neuter, and release. I think with the stray population, it's all about controlling their, it's just neutering them and spaying them so that they're not continuously reproducing. And so that's what she's focusing on. But I didn't get a chance to go, but she spent a couple days there, really appreciated the time there, and thought it was an amazing, it was her first time in the Xinjiang area too.
I'd like to ask one last question. I think if we have time, where haven't you been in China that you really would like to go see?
Yunnan, China is like I was told I think we had a mutual friend named Steven, right? Who the breakdancer.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I haven't caught up with him, but I remember when I first moved to Beijing, he went and hiked Yunnan in some year during the Chinese New Year's. But he talked to me about this it's Niujing, so I think it's beef tendon that is air dried, and then they essentially break it's so that it stores well, right? And then they bring it down from the mountains, and they can make this like braised dish. I really like red braised pork, and so I've always really wanted to kind of backpack across Yunnan and maybe even go to Guilin later, like after that. I want to see more of like the China for its beauty now. Then I've been to all the tier 1 cities, most of the tier 2 cities, and so I'd like to do a little bit more sightseeing. But unfortunately most of my trips are always like in Beijing or Shanghai, so I haven't had a chance to kind of take that trek yet.
Well, that's amazing. Personally, I look forward to your next trip to China. Hopefully we can hook up and, hang out and spend some time together. Thank you so much for your time, Pat.
Thanks for having me, Jason.